I'm not speaking English that very good. I'm Dutch speaking. If I need some help this afternoon, I hope you will help me.
We'll try.
I'm a musician, mainly conductor. That's the reason why I couldn't do the walk this afternoon. I did a rehearsal. I'll finish my doctorate at Brussels University and at VUB and Brussels Conservatoire next week. We have the last rehearsal on some historical Belgian repertoire, which we'll talk for the next hour. We will not only play old historical music, but we'll play a new piece written by this man at my right side. We play a new piece by Nigel Clark. And all those bit needs, as a conductor, you spend 95% in rehearsals and 5% on stage.
Wow.
So it takes a lot of time, that's the reason I couldn't do the walk. You did visit Flagey this afternoon, you did visit the radio building. There are a lot of links between the things you did during the walk and the musical aspects I will talk about. This guy, Marcel Poot, when the radio station was built in the early 30s, he joined radio station in 35. He was the head of the musical department. This guy, Theo de Jonker, completely unknown, he conducted the second orchestra. They had two orchestras. Frans André was conductor, most famous. Theo de Jonker was the second man. Frans André was French speaking. Theo de Jonker was Flemish speaking. So in that radio building you would have those two languages together. This guy, Gaston Brenta, was head of the music library. He didn't work at the radio station, that is Francis de Bourguignon. If you ever eat a pêche melba, you know the dessert?
Yes.
Yeah. You know that is named after Nelly Melba?
Yes.
No? No?
Yes.
You know it now? Nelly Melba was an Australian classical singer. She toured around the world. And that dessert is named after the singer, Nelly Melba. Well, this guy, Francis de Bourguignon, studied in Brussels. He toured 15 years with Nelly Melba worldwide as the piano accompanist of the singer. So he didn't work at radio, head of music department. Maurice Schumacher, he was a musicus modulator, very difficult to translate. He would modulate the musical performances just to be transferred into the radio station. So those four, if you name them all, it's a kind of Brussels group which would promote musical modernism after 25. They did gather in 25. And I have a couple of questions for you. It's not a traditional PowerPoint, because I was bored, we don't do PowerPoints. So all the things I tell will not come on the screen, but I did need a PowerPoint. For instance, if you go back a little bit in time, the period of those 7, that's the interwar years, to understand why they gathered and to understand why musical modernism did flourish in Brussels, we need to go back a little bit further in time to, for instance, this period. I suppose this is well known. You know the painter.
Yes.
You know that it's a Flemish painter who mainly worked in Ostend, James Ensor. He would gather very frequently in Brussels. They did organize themselves in some kind of corporation, which is called Les 20. And if you would, you can take it literally. It were the 20 most well-known painters of their age. They would gather themselves and would unite themselves in Brussels. That comes later. You know the painting? You know the name of the painting? You know where it is?
No.
Somebody could answer.
Is that the one in the Getty?
Very good. is the most famous Belgian painting of the fin de siècle. He did present the painting of the during the annual exhibition of Levant in Brussels, and sometimes I have to read it here. They refused it. It never was exposed during Ensor's life, and he kept the painting in his own house in Ostend above his small, he had a small piano in the room, something like this, and the big painting was above his piano. It's not, you can't see it in Belgium anymore. It's, you can see it in Getty in Los Angeles. So as kind of introduction from not only music but paintings from that period, this one was a bit forgotten in Brussels. You know this one? Of course you know this one. You did walk this afternoon. You could tell where it is. It's one of the most famous Victor Horta designs. Is in the Janson Street. It's next to Avenue Louise. And it dates from 93, 94, 1893, 94. It was the first important building that Horta built. It's one of his main designs. Horta can be seen as the most profound, the father of a new style developed in Brussels in that area. I think you all know the name of that new style. Is the Art Nouveau, very typical for that. You know this?
Yeah. Stevens.
If you walk from Sablon, and if you walk to Kapellekerk, if you go to the right, we can talk about a lot of things this afternoon. If you go to the right, you have the best Italian restaurant in the world.
Which
You know
one?
it?
In the world?
It's the best Italian restaurant in the world. You should visit the name.
Sensational.
It's named Genko. It's excellent. If you have Genko at the right, you have this awful 26th floor office to the left.
It should be the
On that
English
place,
and,
on that place in Brussels, and the late 19th century, this building was there.
Oh yeah.
This building is completely lost, is completely forgotten. It was considered during his lifetime as the masterpiece of Victor Horta. It's very difficult to translate in English. In French is Maison du Peuple. In Dutch is Volkshuis van Horta. In English, it's
People's Palace.
People's Palace?
It's
People's Palace,
People's
we call it,
Palace,
yeah.
yeah.
People's Palace.
It's where people like you would meet during the weekend to discuss, to eat, to go to lectures, to go to concerts. If you see the picture on the right, there was the 2,800 seat modern concert hall in that building. Just to prove that a lot of well-known art from that period in Brussels is lost and forgotten, even from a well-named as Victor Horta. You ever saw this?
No.
I think nobody knows it.
Yeah, it's in the same conteneur, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. It's not often open.
Very good.
That's when I've not yet seen it, but I know of it.
So it's inside.
It's amazing. It's an artwork in Flemish. It's called a relief. In French is the same. I don't know the name in English.
Same relief.
It are 18 blocks of Italian Carrara marble, sculptured by one of the most famous Brussels artists, Jeff Lambeau. It's a name you should know.
Yeah.
This was his masterpiece. I just read, you can find it in Saint Clantonnère now, but I should read the story for you. and then you see why it's forgotten and lost, like a lot of Belgian art of that period. It is exposed in a small temple in Saint-Cantenaire. If you have Saint-Cantenaire here, if city center would be there, that small temple is facing city center and facing European buildings. Just at the end of it. It's very small, it's completely closed, it's completely locked. That little temple was Victor Horta's first commission by the Belgian government, commissioned to put that relief by Jeff Rameau inside the temple. It's called the human urges, de menselijke driften. In French, I don't know. How would you say it in French?
In French, isn't it?
No, even more detailed.
Higher up, driften.
If you say the paintings, it's you should visit in real life just to make an enormous impression. But it didn't make any impression at all in the time that Rameau made it. Indeed, it was exposed for the first time in Ghent in 1889, and it caused quite a stir in the Catholic press, which labeled the work as being totally immoral. You can see all those very nice sculptures, ladies and men doing all sorts of things that the Catholic press would describe as that's immoral. We can't show this to the general public. So what they said, we have that Horta small temple. We put the relief inside, and what did they do? They asked Horta just to close the temple. Normally it was an open temple, but then they closed it completely, and it looks like that. And even closing the temple was not enough. They put
columns.
Yeah, the columns were there, but normally the temple is open and you could see the relief from outside. But just because it was that immoral, it was completely locked for a long time. Then it was considered at 1897 for the World Fair in Saint-Cantenaire. It was completed, but it never was available for public to visit. It was closed with wooden panels. Even our very Catholic King Baudouin, you know it in French, King Baudouin, he had a marvelous idea in 1978. If you have that, you can see where it is in the park. At that side, you have the big mosque.
Yes.
It's owned by the Saudi Arabian government, and King Baudouin thought, we should give this temple as a kind of present to Saudi Arabia. And he thought if we give this present and the Saudis would open the temple with all the naked bodies, it would be demolished completely. But that didn't happen because the Saudi Arabian government refused the present. So it's still owned by Belgian government, and you can visit this piece of marvelous artwork. I think you can visit it twice a month. In the afternoon.
I gave up. Oh, it's open twice a month?
You should visit. It's amazing. You can
What
buy
time?
You can see it on the website of Saint-Cantenaire. You have to buy the ticket at Saint-Cantenaire, and it's available with a guide. I think twice a month. Nobody knows the process. That's why this piece of art from that period is forgotten. It's still there in the temple. We will listen to some music now of the same area, just as that was a kind of introduction, just to show that even very worthwhile products from that area were or lost or forgotten, also in music. We'll listen to a piece of music. Listen carefully. I'll put it on a volume. It's nearly the same as you would hear it live. And it's called a poème symphonique, a symphonic poem. in the form of an overture and an opening work, and is based on this painting. It's a forgotten Brussels artist. He's called Antoine Wiertz. And if you love Brussels, he has an excellent museum. It was his workshop. It's immense. He loved to paint large scale. It's a bit of Rubens, but it's late Romantic style.
Yeah.
And his workshop can be visited. It's next to the entrance of European Parliament. It's the Wiertz Museum. Based on that painting, and that's the start of my musical story. This guy in the left, born in 1865 in city center, next to the Zuidstraat, and it's really in city center, in between Grand Place and in between National Opera. Paul Gisson was born in 65, and he writes in 1900 this piece of music. Please listen, and I'll ask you some questions afterwards. I'll let you hear probably 1 minute and a half of the beginning of that piece. So music based on this painting. Richard Strauss did visit Brussels for the Concert Populaire in 1896 and 1897. It's a bit in the style of Richard Strauss, late Romantic, very expressive music for a large orchestra, a bit like the paintings, heavy colors, very rhythmical, very alive. Did you notice other interesting bits? Do you know this piece?
Lots of brass.
Yeah, lots of wind instruments. Yeah.
Lots of brass, lots of winds, excellent. You did miss some instruments?
No
Didn't
drums.
think that's in the way of strings.
No strings. No
Good
drums.
remark. No strings. Did you miss something in the music? Are the strings necessary? Did it feel incomplete because we had no strings?
No.
It's a piece composed especially and specifically for wind band, and that's the direction we will take in the further on in the story. He loved to compose for big orchestra, but he had one main problem.
When orchestras like it in Brussels at the time.
We have an expert audience. It's very strange. Every capital in Europe had professional symphonic orchestras a century or 50 years earlier, until that group which is called the synthetist, which we saw in the beginning. Those 7 composers are students from Paul Gisson. Even in their age, we had no professional symphony orchestra in Brussels. That's quite strange, because we had a very strong cultural scene, a strong musical life, but no symphony orchestra. But that doesn't prevent Paul Gilson writing symphonic music. It doesn't sound as music we would expect from a wind band from that time. The music you could expect from a wind band in that time. It sounds funny, but that was the music in that period. Wind bands would play. They played for entertainment, and they played popular bits that people like. But Gilson, he did write that symphonic music, nearly the same as Richard Strauss' Don Juan, like Till Eulenspiegel or Don Juan. It's very serious music. Do we miss the strings? I don't miss them. Could you tell some other bits about the piece? It had some qualities, no? Some musical substance, some seriousness, which you would not link with the repertoire we just heard by that wind band, which is merely entertaining and a bit low class. This poem Symphonico from l'Ouverture, dating 1900, I think it's first class music. Nobody knows it, not even the worldwide experts in ancient historical repertoire for wind band music. It's complex. Why doesn't anybody knew this piece?
No, it says there.
It was not played until 25 for the first time, because it was very difficult. It was not published, it was not available. He composed it with the band of the Royal Military Band of the Belgian Guides, that's the name that comes back in the story, but they didn't play it. All those small village bands around Brussels, they couldn't play difficult music like that. It was not available. It lay in Brussels Conservatoire, in the library, in the archives, until 10 years when I found the score. I didn't take the score, but the score is quite unreadable. It is very detailed handwriting, but there were no individual parts. If you want to play a piece of music by a composer, usually you have a score for the conductor and you have the individual parts to the players. Those parts were missing. So there was a source in Brussels library, which you nearly could read. There were some individual parts in the library of the Belgian Guides, and there was a symphonic version in Antwerp in the archives of Conservatoire, which he made for symphony orchestra 20 years later, just to get the second chance that this piece would probably ever get performed. During his life, Gilson heard one performance. I restored all that material just to be, it's part of my interest and part of my investigation. I unlocked it, we recorded it. I think it's excellent music, and it's quite extraordinary for that period, but it's lost and forgotten. It's not unique, because you saw with all the other bits of art from Belgian culture, some other bits were lost and forgotten also. I want to talk about three things during that fin de siècle, bit before we arrive in the Roaring Twenties. If you would come to Brussels in that area, I would love to be in that period, because Brussels was quite interesting. From the 19th century onwards, Brussels expanded enormously geographically, and there was a lot of industry surrounding the city. And Brussels flourished as a cultural metropolis. It became a cultural crossroad within Europe, and the highlight of that Brussels musical life was the turn of the century. You had worldwide, you had a center before if you go back in history between 1850 and 1880, the cultural bit in the world was not Brussels, but Paris. Paris was the place to be. But then you see from 1880 onwards until the First World War, that sometimes in cultural life, Brussels takes the lead. And especially in classical music, there are three moments in history where Brussels is just much more excited and much more adventurous than Paris. And it's quite extraordinary that at those three main periods, Wagner in Brussels, the Russian school in Brussels, and then we will see later on Les Vingt et la Libre Esthétique. Those three main points in history. Who was sitting at the first row? Paul Gilson. He witnessed all those new things in Brussels. If you know something about modernism and classical music, at the end of the 19th century, there's only one composer who dominates musical world all over Europe. All the people are crazy about opera, and there's one composer that completely renews the thoughts about opera. He's creating a Gesamtkunstwerk, not an opera that takes 2 hours to listen, but really big, adventurous modern music as Wagner. Wagner had some problems to get his operas performed out of Germany, however. But they were performed in Brussels. From 1850, we had Charles Louis Hansens. He was head of La Grande Harmonie in city center. That was an organization made by civilians. They made their own symphony orchestra, which played concerts in their own hall. That hall is demolished now. It was in the, you know, the Mont des Arts Kunstwerk. You know the Salle de la Madeleine. It's a casino now. If you walk from Grand Place and you walk to Mont des Arts, if you go to the last street on the right, there was a concert hall. It's now a casino that was owned by La Grande Harmonie. And they would organize for themselves symphony orchestras in the winter inside, and they would transform their symphony orchestra in a wind band in the summer. That wind band would play outdoor concerts in Brussels, in the Royal Park. That conductor of the Grand Harmonie, he got in contact with Wagner and asked to be for his Lohengrin to perform in French in La Monnaie, which they did. Wagner comes to Brussels, that's 1860, conducts his own work at La Monnaie, and from that time on Wagner is very popular, especially when in 1861 his Tannhauser, his new opera, is refused in Paris. Doesn't work, French public doesn't like, and the high bourgeoisie in Brussels thought, if that Wagner doesn't work in Paris, we'll grasp him and bring Wagner to Brussels, which worked. So later on, from 1880 till 1920, Wagner lost much of his fans in Paris, and the Brussels cultural life managed to recover Wagner for the following decades. In some sources, it's written that those 30 years are just me to think, because the original quote is in French. 30 jaar of was een Nederlandstalig in de zaal.
30 years of cultural domination?
Yes, but even much stronger than domination.
Hegemony.
Hegemony. Yeah.
The word hegemony.
Ja, echt de kracht van Wagner, the power of Wagner in Brussels was enormously. They did a lot of premieres of Wagner in Brussels. They had some symphony concerts, and it's a quote from that period. The concert say was a concert populaire, and they always said if we too much contemporary or special repertoire, the audience doesn't turn up, and they were in a deficit, and they said, yeah, it's time to program some Wagner. And then did a Wagner program, and the hall was full. A lot of French people would come, and so Wagner first. The first quote is a quote that Paul Gilson wrote. He heard the Ring des Nibelungen, 4 operas in a row, were performed in Brussels. Due to Karel Buls, who was mayor of Brussels, he got a special ensemble, professional singers selected by Wagner, and they did a world tour. They were in London, they were in Amsterdam, they played in Brussels first. And that's the quote that Gilson wrote after that performance. I was already a sturdy lad when I still hadn't seen an opera. Later, however, we occasionally went to the Monet together with his mother. He was born in city center. They moved city center to the south of Brussels in Ruisbroek. That comes later on. But then they returned to city center. His mother opened a pension for students in city center. And that's the period, he's young, 20, he's beginning 20s, when he goes to the opera with his mother. Before we leave, or before we left, he would drink a large cup of black, heavy coffee, just in order to stay awake. He says, for example, I saw La Juive, it's an opera by Halévy, French opera, which seemed tremendously long for me. Once I had asked my mother, what is Lohengrin? That's one of the Wagner operas, and she answered me, that is music that tears the ears apart. Is that a good translation? Tears the ears apart. So it's much too modern for the ears of Gilson's mother. After all, Wagner was then the modernist, and his music had not yet fully reached us. And then Gilson says, but never shall I forget the impression that the 1883 performance of the Nibelungen with artists of Bayreuth, chosen by Wagner himself, made on my youthful mind. That was a revelation, that was music, that was an orchestral style. So it was much into that Wagner. I'll play you a piece of an overture for fanfare band. We'll play for 3 minutes. It starts lyrical, low, easy. Then you have a kind of French operette bit, very fancy, very giocoso. Just tell me when you hear the Wagner in the Gilson. writing original music, did you miss the strings? This was an original piece, not for wind band, but for fanfare band. So only brass, saxophones and percussion, no strings at all. Why does it sound so good? Because he's a master in orchestration. He can use different colors, even with limited sources, so you don't really miss the strings, do you? You did recognize the lyrical introduction, then the French style operetta, and you did recognize the Wagner.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
It's an early work. He was only 16 years old when he composed the Ouverture du Pirate. It was kept in manuscript in Antwerp Library. I did reconstruct this one, I think, 15 years ago. Just as an example of his very early works. Where did he get that experience? Because a composer he needs some training. There was no professional orchestra, but Brussels was full of bands like this. It's very difficult in research to find examples of amateur wind bands and brass bands from that period. This is a picture, and I just have to look into my paperwork. It's taken in 1904, and it's taken in the place where Gilson lived. I already said he was born in the city center. The family left for Ruisbroek for a while, and then they came back to city center. It was the band he could work with. It's a fanfare band. They're quite rich, they have good instruments. They're well trained by a military bandmaster.
No women.
No women.
Before 1950 in bands, no women allowed. They all, it seems familiar in that area. There's something else that's striking. They all have a mustache.
Allowed, they didn't have the stuff.
This is a picture taken in 1904 when the band won the first prize in a competition organized in city center by a big Brussels city center fanfare band. So Gilson lived in that town in Ruisbroek. You know where Ruisbroek lies? If you have city center and you go to the south, you follow the canal, then you have Drogenbos, you have Ruisbroek, you have Buizing, you have Halle. Around 1880, that part of the city was famous for something. What do you think?
Beer.
Beer.
I can forget.
I just look in my papers.
Lovely beer.
They had a problem in city center. City center was very busy. They did a lot of large-scale works in city center. The big boulevards were constructed, and industry was pushed away a bit from city center, so that south of Brussels, from Anderlecht on, if you follow the canal till Halle, that was the main part where industry flourished at the end of the 19th century. Large industrial complexes were put along the canal. This is a large industrial linnenweverij, very difficult to translate in English.
Was there a mill?
Yeah, I just see, how did I translate it? It's a bleaching plant, is that the word? It was planted in 1852 in Ruisbroek. This is Ruisbroek, the fanfare band where Paul Gilson. He wrote his very first pieces for that band, very easy, and then just by writing them, by playing the pieces with the band, he became a master in orchestrating for such a group. Because in that time there was no sketchbook, there was no manual, There was no book which you could read. You just had to learn it and then try those pieces. This is the second example. It's a bit, you see this, is the railway,
Oh.
the train, which brings the rich industrial parts from Wallonia to Brussels and to Flanders. In that time, Wallonia was the rich part of the country, and it had the rich, it had to be transported. So we had the railway station. This building is Kapellemans en dat Boost. It's not in Ruisbroek. You can see where it is. It's in Buisken. It's a small gemeente. It's a small commune from Halle. This was a porcelain factory where all the luxury goods, all the porcelain bits for the rich in the city center was made. It was a huge factory. They needed a lot of workers which they couldn't find in the area because the industry was so flourishing. They had to find workers from Wallonia, from France, and they came to work together with the Flemish-speaking community in that porcelain factory. In the beginning, they would have a choir in that factory, and they would sing in Dutch. But because of all those foreign workers coming from Wallonia and France, it became more and more difficult to sing in different languages. So they decided, yeah, let's organize this. This is a picture taken in 1874, you can see the factory at the back. And it's a very rare picture because on most pictures you see the musicians standing a bit like a football team in different rows. And you can see a bit of instruments laying on the floor. But this is a very rare photo when you can see the musicians holding their instruments, and they hold very expensive, well-made instruments made in city center. No woman. It was the head of the factory, and this was the conductor. So the head of the factory supported that fanfare very well. It's very strange. I received this photo only 4 years ago, and Nigel knows which band this is. Well, of course, that's the fanfare band. I conducted the brass band, but it was started as this fanfare band. And if you see the difference in our specific genre we work a lot in, this is the most worldwide, this is the most famous band. It's a picture from around the same area. It has not the same good quality. But if you see less players. You see uniforms of lesser quality, which means there's less money involved. And you see instruments, for instance, these big tuba players. That's an older style of instruments if you compare them just with the instruments which were used in Brussels. So you can, it's very strange because in our small world, those English people, they always think they invented brass bands and wind bands and fanfare bands. But at the same area in Brussels, these things existed to a far higher degree of musicianship than they had in the UK. And the thing they didn't have in the UK, they didn't have composers at that time. 1850 till 1920, they had a couple of good composers after Henry Purcell, but they had to wait until Elgar, Holst, Vaughan Williams, that area. So within those periods, we had Paul Gilson working in Brussels, writing that original music for this kind of band. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have wrote a note for this genre. You could consider Wagner as late Romantism, that Russian school in a number of countries developed very strongly, and the most strongly developed national school was that Russian national school. You perhaps know the Russian Five, the most well-known of those Russian Five composers is Mussorgsky. Perhaps you know Night on a Bare Mountain. You know Mussorgsky, you know the leader. You know some operas of those Russian Five. You had Mussorgsky, you had César Cui, you had Rimsky-Korsakov, a bit lesser known as composer, but well known as a scholar. You had César Cui, Borodin, Balakirev. Those five, they were more famous in Brussels at 1890 than they were in Russia or than they were in Paris. They would play their first concert in Liège, but soon the Brussels elite could attract Rimsky-Korsakov to come to Brussels. He did 2 concerts populaires in Brussels. In letters to his wife, he's very positive about Belgian music life. He said, yes, those people really listen to my music. The orchestra is very well prepared, and it's much easier to work in Brussels than to work in my own country or to work in France. Those Russians were invited by Gravine de Mercy d'Argenteau, very rich lady who would live in Liège. She supported all the Russians. She wrote a book about César Cui. Those 5 composers came to Brussels. Paul Gilson met them. He did write letters with César Cui for 30 years. And he did met their publisher, because music is one part of the business, but if the music is not published, then it's just dead. They had to sponsor a mecenas, which was called Belyayev. That sponsor came to Brussels not only to support concerts, but he met Gilson and asked Gilson to make arrangements of Russian music for wind band, for fanfare band. If you know the most famous piece by those Russian 5, it's a piece by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. It's a fairy tale. It has an Eastern Europe title, because Eastern Europe and Orientalism was very popular in that time. You know Scheherazade, I'm sure.
Yes.
The piano reduction of Scheherazade is published by Belyayev. It's not made by Rimsky-Korsakov. It's an arrangement made by Paul Gilson. Also his Groot Russisch Paasfeest, Grand Park Russe, arranged by Gilson. Just a small musical example of that Russian style. It's completely different from the Wagner style. Russian music is more refined in its orchestration. Wagner is very robust, very contrast heavy. Russian music much more delicate. It's a bit a link in musical history to French Impressionism. I'll let you hear a remarkable piece. You listen first, and then I'll tell you a small story behind the piece. instrument?
The saxophone.
You did recognize the saxophone. Very good. It's the finale from the first saxophone concerto written in 1901, 1902, 2 years. Paul Gilson wrote 2 saxophone concertos. His first saxophone concerto is really also the first saxophone concerto written for the instrument by any composer. It was lost. Gilson never heard it play. It was commissioned from an American lady for Eliza Hall. She had problems hearing well, and her husband was a doctor, and he thought, yeah, when she plays a wind instrument, that will help getting the hearing back, and it will help to support the breathing. They did find in America a saxophone, so the lady played the saxophone, not as a professional player, but just on a low standard, to develop the hearing problems. Her husband died at a very young age. He was rather rich, so that meant that Eliza Hall suddenly was very rich. She played the saxophone, and she thought, yeah, I should support cultural life in Boston, and I will commission some composers to write specifically for my instrument. But they did have the same problem in America at that time. A good cultural life, but no big name composers. So she got in touch with a lot of French composers. She commissions, I think, 25 pieces for the saxophone. One of that pieces is the concerto by Gilson. All the rest, she commissions Claude Debussy to write a rhapsody. Claude Debussy is not really interesting with that American lady. He's not really interested in writing something good for the saxophone. So it takes a while. It takes a while. It takes the money, but it takes a while before he writes the piece. Gilson is in need of money. He's very enthusiastic about that new instrument. In Brussels Conservatoire, they have a teacher. They don't have teachers in Paris for saxophone at the Conservatoire. They have a teacher, Gustave Poncelet. He can work with that teacher, and he writes an extremely interesting saxophone concerto. Send it to America, to Eliza Hall, but the piece comes back to Brussels. It's in the archives of the Conservatoire, and Eliza Hall refused the concerto.
Why?
Was it too difficult?
Very good. All the French pieces are rather slow, rather impressionistic. This concerto is very virtuosic. It's very, very difficult. So
Well, what we just heard is extremely high level of playing.
She couldn't play that concerto. So the
She
piano,
sent it back.
the piano reduction is still in the archives in Brussels Conservatoire, but Gilson, yeah, he did take the check, but he was a
kept
bit
money.
upset, and he scrapped down the name of Eliza Hall, but you can see it. So it was about mad that she refused to commission, but the orchestral version was never played, was lost completely. I was contacted, I think, 12 years ago by an antique shop in the south of France, and I just made the first CD with music of Paul Gilson, and he wrote me an email. I said, you're probably interested. I have a couple of pieces by that composer, and he did send me a picture, so that's quite interesting. You could send them to me. It did cost me a bit of money, but it was okay. And after a while, he still contacted me. He did write me an email. I said, yeah, probably I still have another piece which could be of any interest. I said, yeah, this could take a while. Perhaps we can visit you while we are on holidays, and then you can show me your collection, and you can tell me the reason why you have an original manuscript of Paul Gilson in the south of France. So we visited that antiquariat, Monsieur Eric Arbouin, in the south of France. It wasn't a very pleasant visit, but he showed me all the music. It was huge, a lot of bits, and I was looking, not interesting, interesting, oh, manuscript, interesting, manuscript, interesting. So I've got a pile of music over here, interesting, and all the rest not interesting. And then we discussed, and I said, yeah, this pile of music, really interesting. But then he sold me one set, and he said, yeah, this is 150 euros, and this makes 500 euros, and that's like 1500. So we had a bit of discussion, this didn't work. He thought, yeah, I found somebody who was interested in that music. So I think I bought one or two scores, that was okay. But I said, yeah, all that music, perhaps you should send me a list. And then he did put some photos on his website of all the pieces he had from Gilson. Those pieces were in a collection by one of his students, and during the war, that student took all the music he had in his archive, and he moved to the demarcation. There was a certain line during the war where the rest of, where there was no war. So he escaped Brussels, he took the music, it was in a big cast.
Chest.
Yes, a very old, and the antique shop bought the music also. To make a long story a bit shorter, he put all those titles on his website, and suddenly I see Premier Concerto. It's very strange. I visited that man, and the most worthwhile original, he didn't show it. But I knew he played a little trick with me because he showed the less interesting bits. But then on the screen I could see, but he has the orchestral score of that first saxophone concerto. And then it took a while to negotiate. It's an enormous, it was a marvelous original. It's bought by the Brussels Conservatory. I've restored the original, we recorded the two saxophone concertos and still 3 other works for saxophone that Gilson wrote in a period where the saxophone was not really known. Just to show that he's not only influenced by Wagner, he follows the Russians, he follows even a third important bit of modernism in Brussels. You ever heard about that society, Levant, La Libre Esthétique? People interested in paintings will know this movement very well. Somebody of you ever heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
It was an innovative modernist movement of Belgian painters, 20 painters and sculptors. They were active from 83 till 93. They reacted and rebelled against all that was academic painting. They were supported by Octave Maus, and Maus wanted to make cultural movements from all over Europe known in Brussels. And Maus was a meloman. He loved the paintings, but he was a music lover also. So every year when they would organize a salon with paintings, at the beginning or at the end of those exhibitions, he would organize 1 or 2 concerts, mainly chamber music, because there was no symphony orchestra, and mainly French chamber music, because he thought if I make publicity for modern French paintings, French impressionistic music, mainly Debussy, Dupart, Dandy, was very popular in Brussels. Debussy would come to Brussels to play in these concerts organized by Levant and others. Gilson would be on the first row. His music would be played also in salons, in settings like this, before those exhibitions took place. The concerts were famous, especially when Eugène Ysaÿe, the world famous violin player, joins Levant in 1888. It's a long introduction just to show that Paul Gilson, a name I think for a wider public, it's lost and forgotten, like some of those paintings or sculptures in the beginning. But he was in the forefront of musical modernism in fin de siècle. I do a little quiz with you, it only takes 1 minute. Those numbers 276 question mark. He did write 276 works for wind band. If some of us work day and night, 276, it's enormous. It goes from very short pieces, but very long, expanded works for choir and wind band. Gilson was born in 1865. He only writes one symphony. Another Belgian composer, very well known, he writes one symphony in G minor. You know who ADB is? First class Belgian composer, Auguste de Boek, good friend of Paul Gilson. Then we go to other composers in Europe, the same period. Born in 1865, G.S., he writes 7 symphonies. Jean.
Sibelius.
Yes, Sibelius. He writes 7 symphonies. C.M., the same. Carl Nielsen, he writes 6 symphonies. Russian, A.G. Alexander Glazunov writes 8 symphonies. It's amazing to see the difference. Both Paul Gilson and Auguste de Boek, they write large-scale opera, they want to write symphonies, they want to write symphonic music, but they only write one. The Gilson Symphonie and Chorale has never been performed, not during his life, not after his life, it's still in manuscript. The Auguste de Boek Symphony, it's played now and then. I think you can find it on YouTube. It's a very nice symphony, but they couldn't develop those composers in Brussels writing large-scale symphonies because no symphony orchestra. They had a professional symphony orchestra 170 years earlier in Berlin, 94 years earlier in
Vienna.
Vienna, 92 years earlier in Copenhagen, 53 years earlier in Berlin Philharmonic, 47 years earlier in the
Amsterdam.
Concertgebouw. The only bands we had in Brussels were the orchestra of the opera, La Monnaie, and the royal band of the Belgian Guides, the wind band. What we, however, had in Brussels, we had in Gilson's time 2 professional orchestras and 88.
Fanfare.
Yes, in Brussels City, only in City, not in the south, just Brussels City and those small communes surrounding Brussels, 88. Now in 2023, in Brussels, we have 3 professional orchestras, La Monnaie, Brussels Philharmonic, national orchestras, and we have they all disappeared. We don't
In
have
Brussels.
any wind band, any fanfare band anymore in Brussels.
They've all gone outside,
So
gone away.
that's completely other story. That's a bit of the context. We saw the pictures of those fanfare bands. We move on very quickly in time now. You know this guy? Don't forget him. Paul Gilson, very important figure. We don't listen to everything. That's one of his small pieces he wrote as a 13-year-old student, just to cry a little funeral march.
As you do, as you do.
Exactly.
This is a theme of variations, 25 minutes of music for brass ensemble. Restored from the manuscript. We've recorded it, I think, 15 years ago. And you can see the nightmare when you have to restore originals like this.
listen in the middle.
Because you have composers who write it from the first time correctly. You have composers who change their mind, who make different versions now and then. Jinsol was one of them. He changed his mind, he thought it would be better, or that would be better. He made several versions of one original. We move on from that interbellum and we go to the Roaring Twenties in Brussels. I promised no normal PowerPoint, so we will listen to the things that happened after the World War. We had a lot of problems during that war. 4 years, no music activity in the city center. But the situation of modernism and modern music changed dramatically after that First World War. All the isms, Impressionism, Expressionism, Neoclassicism, even radical modernism, who were absent before that war, suddenly became available for composers. The younger generation of the students of Jinsol, those 7 people we saw in the beginning, they thought, yeah, now it's time to make a radical change and we want to compose in our own style. We want to go completely for that modernism. So all those musical forms were present in the city. You had a lot of other bits present in the city. You still had those old-fashioned outdoor concerts. This is the Vauxhall, which you really should visit. It's a parallel. It's in a Koninklijk Park, Park Royal. It's a bit hidden. If you know the Théâtre du Parc, it's in the back. In the 20s, you would have open air concerts, symphony orchestras, or in this case, a wind band would play outdoor concerts every weekend. You had this in Brussels, the café concert and the café chantant. You had the brasseries, where a small orchestra, a pianist, or a small string ensemble, or a singer would play while you had a drink. You had this in Brussels. It's the most famous of all. You can see an advertisement of 2 concerts that John Philip Sousa played in the Alhambra around 1900. You had this in the 1920s.
It's the cinema.
You had a booming film industry in Brussels. We had the first films in Brussels in 1996, but in 1908, the French Pathé Frères, that were the first pioneers of large film producers, opened an independent branch in Brussels, and film became an important part of leisure activities for the people. They make a really big hall, Pathé Palace, Avenue Anspach. In the city center in the 20s, you have a lot of new cinemas arise in the same area, Nieuwstraat, Rue Neuve, Rogierplein. The center of entertainment in the Roaring Twenties was the Place de la Brucaire. It was the place where where people would meet. We had 2 movie palaces like this, one with 3,000 seats in the Rue Neuve, one El Dorado, Place de la Brucaire, and those big cinemas, they would employ a symphony orchestra to accompany the silent movies, because in the 20s it was not used, there were no, you know it in detail, Nigel. We had in 1925 in Brussels 96 cinemas, and in those 96 cinemas, 19 had a large orchestra, and large means 35, 40 players. 37 had a small orchestra, and 40 had only a piano player to accompany the film, but it's huge compared to today. So 96 cinemas, and 57 have an orchestra. All composers, all students in the evening or in the afternoon would play in those small orchestras. That's another film hall, and you can see the place where the orchestra, where the pit for the orchestra is on the left side. And you had this in Brussels. We didn't have a professional symphony orchestra, but we had this famous wind band, this picture taken in the Brussels Conservatoire by the band, the Royal Band of the Belgian Guides. And this is their conductor at that time, Arthur Prévost. They had a huge instrumentation, which they even don't have these days, an instrumentation up to 85 players. They would have all instruments. They would have 2 bassoons, a double bassoon. They would have 25 clarinets. So if you have a band like that, and if you have a teacher like Paul Gilson, and if you are a young composer in 1925, and if you don't have a symphony orchestra, what would you do? It's quite easy. There's only one solution. They have a teacher who knows how to orchestrate for a wind band. You have 7 very good students. They say, oh, let's gather, let's make a movement. And that movement is called les synthétistes in French, or in English, the synthetists. They needed a name, so they thought we should synthesize all those modernisms that are available in Brussels. And they worked together for 15 years. They composed 77 works for this kind of band, and all these 77 works were completely lost and forgotten, except for one. That one piece is called the Danse Funambulesque, composed by Jules Strens. If you put it in YouTube, I think you have 15 versions from Japan to America, all over the world they play that piece. The 76 other pieces are lost and forgotten because they were not published. For my study, I restored those pieces. We've recorded them again, and I just let you hear a couple of them, and I invite you to a concert on next week. Entrance is free. Bring some friends to hear music of those 7 Belgian composers.
And one English one.
And one English one. To disturb the Belgian
Bit more modern.
students. That's the picture that works. You had 4 elements why this story became a success for those young composers. You had a teacher who could teach them how to write for wind band, and you had a conductor who took a risk, because it's very easy a job as a conductor. You just play the music that sells well, and everyone is happy, the players are happy, you don't disturb the players, and the audience is happy, because if you hear a piece you know, it's easy. If you come to listen to a piece you don't know, it's much more complex for an audience. But that conductor took a risk. it's composed, if Nigel would compose a piece like that with that instrumentation for a straightforward military band, they would say, it's okay, but can you change the part for double bassoon? Because we don't have a double bassoon. And it's very complex, and it goes for the piccolo and 3 flutes, but we only have 2 flutes. And they would say, oh, it's nice that you use the celesta, but we don't have a celesta. And the harp is very nice, but we don't have a harp. But those composers had not that problem. They didn't have to do any kind of toegeving.
Compromise.
Yeah.
They didn't have to compromise because the band of the guys had it all. So that's the story of those 7 Brussels composers gathering through the interbellum. That's the answer that their teacher said. For the general audience, you just have to listen without prejudice and judge for yourself, because it's very, very good music. It now is available in different sources, but if you are interested, just start perhaps with this. It's for free. If you give your name to Nigel, you're very welcome. It's 8 o'clock. It's very strange to say to yourself, but it are 2 really world-class bands playing music that was never played before. The Belgian guides played that music in the 20s, then it was lost and forgotten. Now it's coming to life again.
And it's the band of the Air Force, isn't it?
It's the band of the Air Force, that's a military band, and it's a French champion band, it's a brass band. They play before the break, and what's quite unusual, at the end they play together. We do 3 small pieces, just to finish the concert. So if you have time, if you want to hear something which you didn't hear the last 100 years, I hope, now it comes to life again. So if you have any questions for me, just pose them now, please.